Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome everybody to this webinar. My name's Tobin Broadfoot. I'm the product director at Keyless and consumer side. And today, I'm genuinely pleased to be moderating a webinar between two titans of the identity industry, and we'll get onto the introduction of them shortly.
Wow.
We're gonna talk about digital identity and the rise of decentralized systems, and that's a mouthful, and that's why I've stumbled over it. And so that's why we're also going to talk about what that really means. Um, the takeaways we'd like everyone to come away with today are just that, like what does that really mean? But most importantly, why does that matter? It's a term, it gets thrown around, and that sets us up for the second of the second part of this two-part webinar, where we'll be then talking about the impact. But this is really just getting to the guts of what we mean by it and why it matters. So hopefully that's going to be really interesting. Quick housekeeping: share your comments and questions in the Zoom chat. We'll respond live at the end if possible, or we'll follow up by email. And now I'll hand over to the two speakers today. So, David, do you want to start by introducing yourself, and then Frank, you go next.
Sure. My name's Dave Birch. I'm an author, advisor, and commentator on digital financial services. And I'm also a senior research fellow at the Qatar Centre for Global Banking at King's College London, which is where I'm dialing in from today. Dialing in, how old am I? No, this is where I'm connecting from today.
Welcome to the webinar, David. Myself, I'm Frank Martins. I'm an identity specialist in charge of the commercial activities of Keyless Technologies in the UK. And it will be a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I want to, before we sort of dive into things, Frank, I kind of want to set the scene a little, because I want people to understand why it is that people like me are so interested in this topic, and why people like me are so interested in what you're doing. So let me just give you a couple of examples of the things that I think frame what you guys are doing. Now, I'm not sure if you're supposed to have a favorite data breach. I mean, you shouldn't really, should you? That's like like your favorite crime, sort of. But you know, you can't help admiring the scale of some of these things. I have lots of favorites actually, but let me just put a couple of my favorites in front of you. So, Optus. There was a massive data breach at Optus Telecommunications in Australia. The personal details of about a third of all Australians were stolen in this breach. And I remember at the time, I mean, I shouldn't laugh about these sort of things, it's not funny, but I remember at the time reading in one of the Australian newspapers, an Optus spokesman said, well, the criminals got, the name, address, and, tax number and mobile phone, email address, copies of the passport and driving license, but luckily, no financial information was stolen. Oh, well, that's okay then. So, and I remember thinking at the time, why did they have copies of people's driving licenses? And like, how does your ability to drive influence your ability to use a mobile phone? I mean, it seems puzzling. And I thought, well, it can't just be incompetence. This must be something to do with the government. And of course, it's to do with ancient regulations about keeping identity documentation around for no reason, I might add. Now, I mean, I shouldn't be joking about that, because obviously it was very disruptive for a lot of people and it was very problematic. But actually things get even more serious than that. One of the other big data breaches that people often talk about is Ashley Madison, which is a very famous data breach. Something like 37 million people's personal information was stolen. This is for a dating site for inappropriate relationships between consenting adults, I might add. And that's a situation where people committed suicide. I mean, this wasn't funny at all. This wasn't people's bank data being stolen. You can get back again. This was like personal data of them.
Yeah.
And even in government, I mean, I know that you're familiar with this, but the Office of Personnel Management, the big US government department that manages, federal they were hacked, 21 million personal records stolen. And one thing that caught my eye about that was the note that the hackers, actually, I think the language they use on their website was there was an exfiltration of fingerprint data being used to, identify / authenticate federal workers. So there's a million examples I could have chosen, Frank. I just picked those three, but I just wanted to make the point, what is it that I learned from looking at these? It's basically organizations of one form or another created giant honeypots of personal data, and not just names and addresses, but also personal biometric data, passports and pictures of people and fingerprints in a place where they could be stolen. And I'm sure these were all organizations who thought that they had terrific cybersecurity in place.
Correct.
But as we know, it costs an awful lot of money to go from kind of 99.9% secure to 100% secure. So there's a big problem here, which is that we want to work online. People need to be identified online. People need to be able to log into things. But the way it's being done, by creating these honeypots, which cannot be made 100% secure, even the Office of Personnel Management, it's almost as if we kind of set the whole system up to exhibit the worst conceivable characteristics. It's as like perhaps agents of a foreign power have infiltrated all of the cybersecurity agencies and got everybody to do completely the wrong thing. So my feeling is, and I don't, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, if you think I'm overstating it, tell me. But
No,
I
you're
think
not.
we're in a really bad position.
Well,
So we need to do something concrete to fix this, Frank. So where do we start?
Well, I mean that's the reason we created Keyless. Keyless was created because when we think about, as you mentioned, transacting online, it's very important to be easy, to feel good. We tend not to remember our passwords. We have many devices. We forget passwords. Then how are you going to authenticate not only for login but to do transactions? And of course, there's data there. And that data needs to be private because, as you mentioned in the Australian example, people kill themselves. There was a huge data breach, and we believe, David, that everything is hackable. Even like the most secure tech companies, they got hacked, and everything can get hacked. So that's why we're talking about zero knowledge proofs and zero knowledge biometrics in a privacy preserving way. So if this happens, the worst is to happen, the end user's data is still safe. That's the main idea behind this whole decentralization topic. If we think about, for example, in biometrics, we have the device native biometrics, the likes of Face ID, Samsung Touch, where the data never leaves the device. It's pretty good for some use cases, but not very good if you lose the phone because the data is there, so you cannot access another phone. Then we have the server side, the centralized ones, which would help with the many use cases. But again, it creates what you just mentioned, the honeypot situation. And thirdly, the new category, which we helped pioneer, the decentralized category of biometrics of identity, where pretty much, the data is safe. The data is not stored anywhere. The data sometimes is not even considered PII, personal identifiable information, and we can start setting the scene from there.
Okay. You covered a lot there, Frank. So I feel I've got to go back and break it down a little bit just to make sure I understand how you're responding. So essentially, I outlined two different problems. So there's problem A, which is all of this data being stored in a big honeypot, and problem B, which is that data includes biometric data, which is unique to individuals. So being a bit of a nerd, those in my head, those are two different things. So I want you to break down what you were saying to solve each of those problems. So let's start with the issue of the centralization. What what do those new technologies that you talked about do to avoid the honeypot? And can you just tell us, like, I know you said it very quickly, but can you just go back and just explain what those technologies are a little bit? How do we avoid the honeypot?
So the honeypot, in essence, it's a server, with the stored, for example, in our industry, what we call biometric templates. For someone to do a biometric check, a server somewhere would be holding that template, which would be compared to the new one just extracted when the user is taking a selfie. The issue, as you mentioned, imagine a bank with millions of users, having all those biometric templates in some vendor's server, that would generate what we call the honeypot. So hackers would try to open it because they are usually stored using hash. So it's a static digital quantity. There's a master key for all those faces. So if you can reconstruct one, you reconstruct a few. You can create payments, based on those data, and it would be a scandal for the bank. There would be like huge fraud cases, and would be a nightmare, would be bad. So to avoid that, decentralization is a technique. There are many different types of decentralization techniques. There's some that they do without being too nerdy, what we call the hashing and sharding. They split the values across many different servers. And there's also the zero knowledge proof, where you use, for example, in our case, multi-party computation combined with zero knowledge proofs. And then you need, the user's device together with the server. But sometimes the way the protocols are created, that actual data that is used to achieve the matching is not considered biometric data. It cannot be related to a user or to a specific identity. That's the main thing.
Okay, so just to make sure I've understood this properly then. So if we take the basic case of the bank storing my face so that when I drop my phone down the toilet, I can get my bank account back. Let's take that basic case. So to avoid the honeypot, instead of storing my face in a server somewhere, you break my face up into lots of little different pieces and you store bits of them all on sort of different servers. And that fixes problem
one
A.
technique.
Yeah.
That's one technique called the sharding, but it's still not the most appropriate. Why? Because they're also based in hash values. So it takes one face to recreate it takes one hash being recomputed to recreate the faces. That's why we have chosen the zero knowledge approach with multi-party computation, which in essence is one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. So even if you get hacked, the data is still safe.
Right. So if I break my face up into lots of little different pieces, that solves one problem, but it doesn't solve the other problem, because to put my face back together again, you need some sort of key. And
Correct.
if you get hacked, that key gets all the faces. But you want to solve both of those problems.
Yeah.
So we're breaking the face up into lots of different pieces, but you're not having some sort of master key that puts it all back together again.
Absolutely.
Do I understand this correctly? Okay. So now if I'm a nefarious agent of a foreign power, or an incompetent employee, which is, most of the, if I get into the system, I can't make the faces again.
Correct. Not even an employee, not even a rogue employee, or whatever how we want to call him or her, cannot reconstruct the data. The data cannot be reconstructed, not even by the vendor's own workforce. That is correct.
Right. And this is what interests me. So now I know we're going to go into a bit more detail next week, but just to go down one level to give people a sense of what's going on here. And before you answer, I just want to make it very clear to people, the building blocks that you're using are actually, tried and tested cryptographic techniques. This stuff sounds like wizardry, zero knowledge proofs, secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, cryptographic blinding. To people who don't understand the cryptography, which is essentially everybody, this sounds like something from Harry Potter. So I can do 2 + 2 = 4 without knowing what the 2's are or what the 4 is, and I can see that this sounds crazy. But actually, the tools that are used to do that have been around for quite a while, frankly, haven't they? I mean, this isn't something that's popped up in the last few months.
Now, it's been going, the research has been going for a few years. We actually being the first one to commercially deploy this technology. And as you mentioned, the beauty is that, that there's the need for, there's a device, there's a server, to reconstruct everything is literally impossible and unscalable. So that's the main take for people to learn about zero knowledge combined with multi-party computation. So it's literally impossible for the data to be reconstructed. And, the biggest push for this is not only data privacy, but compliance with regulation, with GDPR. So, banks, biometrics have been going for many years, for more than a decade. But why hasn't it picked up? Why, most banks aren't using this type of tech as yet? Because of the concerns with data. If some vendor somewhere gets hacked, imagine a tier one bank having to explain the next morning, sorry, everyone, people are reconstructing our client's face and making payments. It wouldn't be.
I mean, fortunately, it hasn't happened with a big bank yet. It has happened with big cryptocurrency exchanges, where the cryptocurrency exchanges have been forced to collect biometrics, matching passports and driving licenses, identity cards, and so on. And then when the exchange gets hacked, not only do all the Bitcoin get stolen, but what's far more valuable, all of the passports and driving licenses get stolen, and then they're used to create synthetic identity in other places. So, I mean, fortunately, the banks, as far as we can see, are pretty secure about this sort of thing. But, I still want to loop back around on this just a little bit more before we move on. I know you must be so bored explaining this to people over and over again, but I want to make sure I understand why. So I understand. So we break the faces up and we smear them over servers somewhere, and you can't put them back together even if you break into the system because there's no key to put them back together.
Correct. The private key would never leave the device, and differently from everybody else, Dave.
You're jumping ahead. Remember, you're explaining it to me, not to smart people. So let's do it a step at a time. So it's broken up, and the reason why, even if I break into the server, I can't reconstruct it, is because there is no key in the server to put these things back together. So my natural question then, thinking like the person who runs a bank, is, well, hold on a second then. If Dave drops his iPhone down the toilet and wants to log into the bank, if I don't have the key, how do we put it all back together again?
Well, that's a very good question. So we're not saying that there isn't a quantity being stored. What we're saying is that quantity, those values, they cannot be reverted back to a specific identity, but they can be used, and they are used for the matching process. So even when we do the authentication matching, we do it in the encrypted domain. Nothing is decrypted, and the private key doesn't leave the device. And a randomized key is generated for each user. That's why we're called keyless. There isn't a master key being stored anywhere. So every user, they have their own unique specific key. So in order to scale an attack, they would need the user's device. They need to steal a user's device and hack our servers. And then even if they do so, they would be able to reconstruct one face. If so, it would never be scalable to other users because the key is different. It's a random key on a per user basis.
So again, just to interpret what that means quite simply is, the bits of my face are matched with bits of my face, but they're matched inside encrypted servers where even you can't see inside to see what's being matched. So the server tells you, yes, we've put these fragments together and they've matched, but you can't actually see what any of those fragments are. You can't see what's going on. All you get is a proof, and I mean that in the cryptographic sense, that you get a proof that these things have matched, and that has multiple benefits in a sort of practical implementation, because it means wherever the system's hacked. It's funny because I was thinking about this when I was coming in on the train earlier on, and I happened to be reading something online about a disgruntled former employee going in and I won't say the company, it's not But the point is, even if the most disgruntled of your employees, Tobin, for example, was to decide to was to decide to loot the data from the service, he can't do it.
Correct. That's one of the most important things, because do banks or governments or health institutions trust their suppliers, their vendors, employees? They might now, but you never know who joins the business next month or for the reasons they do. So that is correct. That was also taken into account. So our IT team, let's say our engineers, they cannot reconstruct the data. They don't have access to the data. We would be able to do the matching only in the encrypted domain. So it's like one hand doesn't know what the other is doing, and the values come back as passed or no passed. So that's the one of the key things.
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
So,
sorry.
oh,
Dave.
so can I just ask one more thing, Tony?
Yeah, go for it.
I just because again, I just want to stress this point that this all sounds utterly fantastic, but it's actually built on solid building blocks that have been around. And I should say, by the way, you're not the only people that have started to use secure multi-party computation. You're not the only people. I mean, you've put it together in interesting ways, but actually the industry as a whole is shifting in this direction too. But I just wanted to ask one more question, Francesco, before we go to other people's questions, which is, and again, this is just to sort of root the thing in the real world. When it comes to actually deploying this in a real environment, can you just tell me a little bit about the first bank that you went live with, and just give people a sense of how much effort it was? Because I'm sure it wasn't zero. How much effort was it for the bank to move over to this, what I think of as modern way of interacting with customers?
Well, it's not very difficult at all, because of course they need to educate their clients that there's been a change, but people are very tired of using passwords, and they're also used to doing Face ID, the equipment biometrics. So the actual flow is pretty similar. It's like almost identical. In the end, the end user will look at the camera. So it wasn't that difficult. We're working with tier one banks in Europe. The example that we like to give is Intesa Sanpaolo in Italy, the biggest bank in the country. It didn't take long for them to educate and start migrating users to the keyless platform. So, and again, the good thing is that even if they lose their phone, even they are making payments, it's very easy, very convenient for them to authenticate and make transactions.
Well, presumably you didn't tell customers.
Perfect.
You've got to learn about zero knowledge computation. You've got to learn about zero knowledge proof security. I mean, I'm sure customers didn't have to hear that part of it. So, okay, well, let's go to a couple of questions then. So, Tobin, do you want to pull in a couple of questions for us and challenge Francesco and I?
Yeah, definitely. So, and I'm going to kind of preface this first one. Thank you for it's come up as anonymous, so I don't know who asked it, but essentially they're getting at, and I want to recap what we've laid out, which is there's a big problem, honeypots, hackable data. There's decentralized systems and well established, as you've said, technology to solve it. And because we're handling the complexity, it's not like huge efforts for us to migrate. So I think the question is getting at, we've got these AML and KYC onboarding systems, and that all feels very outdated. What's preventing the industry as a whole kind of moving to the next step and actually moving on to decentralizations, and what needs to change, I think, for that to happen in your view, David?
I am not an expert on the regulatory side of it by any stretch, but I do think things are beginning to shift. And the reason is because there's this crucial point about proofs. So in other words, what the regulators want is evidence that you did what you were supposed to be doing, that you checked this document or you checked this fact about a person or something. What they want is that evidence. And actually, as I think everybody understands, a cryptographic proof is actually much better evidence than a photocopy that's stuffed in a drawer somewhere. So I think, I don't think the problem comes from there. My personal feeling, and obviously Francesco spends more time talking to the banks and the regulators than I do. My personal feeling is it just sounds crazy to them. You know, this idea that I can, or to take the simple example everybody uses when we're discussing this, the idea that I can check that you're over 18 without knowing your age. Now, if you've grown up in the world of cryptography, that is the most trivial of problems. It's a range proof, you know. But if you still think of identity in terms of driving licenses and filing cabinets, it's actually pretty difficult to take that first step. You know, I want to have a proof about a fact about you, but I don't want to know what the fact is. So I don't think the barrier with regulators is something really, really complicated. I think it's just it takes time to understand this stuff. And actually, in many ways, they'll find this preferable to the old ways of doing things.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely, because it helps in all senses. You know, they save a lot of money. They reduce a lot of traffic to call centers, because when you are authenticating people based on knowledge factors, for example, PINs and passwords, it generates a lot of issues on top of fraud. So it's not only a matter of education, I would say. It's a matter of accepting their pace, and how new technologies can get assimilated in the market. There's also
Well,
Mhm.
we're going to talk more about the cost benefit analysis next time, right, Frank? So let's
Correct.
just, for the purposes of this discussion, let's just assume the cost benefit analysis is positive. We'll break it down a bit next time.
Yeah.
But point well taken.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Another question
Tobin.
from Paul. Thank you, Paul. What is wrong with using device biometrics? And Paul, I'm assuming what you're talking about there is Face ID, Touch ID, but please jump in if that's not the right interpretation. You can log into a bank when you get a new device, when you don't have the old one. What's the advantage of device-based biometrics that everyone's very familiar with for unlocking phone, versus what we're talking about here?
I can take that one, if I may. So the device native biometrics like Face ID, Samsung Touch, in my opinion, they're very good for login, to getting access to the phone, because it's very quick. It's almost as instant. However, the biometric values is not controlled by the financial institution. It's a device biometrics, like a password protocol. So if you lose the device, you have nothing. And the main issue is that face that is being matched against the device is whatever face is put there, is not the same face from the KYC process. I think this is the most important point to take into account, that you can, and this happened in the UK recently with a very famous fintech in a shared workspace. Someone shoulder look somebody else, understood their PIN, got their device, put their face, and was able to make transactions. So device biometrics, in my opinion, is very good just for login, not for payments, not for personal data reset. And it's impossible to do account recovery, because if you lose the device, you have nothing. But the main point is that will never be connected to the original face that created the account.
Yeah, I think
Well,
that's a
can I just
yeah.
add something else to that, Frank? Because also I think people do jumble these things up a little bit. But when you're using Face ID, which I use all the time, you're not identifying yourself. This is an authentication mechanism. This is a one-to-one local match, and it works perfectly for that. It delivers the absolute blend of convenience and security. When you lose the phone, or as in my case, when you had the phone nicked, in order to get access on the new device, it isn't simple, because I downloaded the bank app on my new phone, and then I couldn't log in, and then I had to phone the bank, and then I had to prove to the bank who I was using other mechanisms, and go through a loop in order to get the thing rebuilt. And of course, this is where a lot of the fraud takes place, because people game these
Correct. Yeah.
these you know so the device biometrics like Face ID are fantastic, but they're not for this. They have a different purpose. They're for quick and convenient authentication.
And when you got your new phone, Dave, you had to re-register your face again to the new phone, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Again, because it's an
And again,
authentication thing for the
that
device.
that face could be another face. So there's nothing to do with the original face that open account. And that's the problem financial institutions are having. They're changing now. They're not allowing, device native biometrics to authenticate transactions, mainly due to that.
Well, it certainly was a different face because it was a much angrier face than when I located it originally, because I was furious. But yes, it all sort of worked out in the end, so it was okay. But this point about but I think it's worth kind of just emphasizing for a moment there quite why these things are different. The reason why things like Touch ID and Face ID work with phones is because you remember when the first Touch ID came along with the finger on the iPhone? I remember somebody, I was very enthusiastic about this. And I remember somebody wrote to me, one of the people that write to you on the internet, and he said, well, do you know that in Japan, there's someone who can make a finger out of, I can't remember what it was, jelly or something. And then they can take your fingerprint from a glass that you've been using, and they can scan this and they can put it into a machine which will put this fingerprint onto a piece of jelly. And then they can use this piece of jelly to log in to your phone, you know. And I'm like, well, I'm not using it to launch nuclear missiles. If somebody from Japan is going to come and steal my phone, get my fingerprint, make a finger out of jelly, and use, you know what I mean? In order to do what? These are different levels. Like account, you know, what we're talking about here, which is secure identification of customers, is a very different thing from
We talk,
convenient,
yeah.
secure authentication of customers.
What we've been saying differently from just like authenticating a device to get access to devices about genuine identity assurance. How do you provide financial institutions and businesses in other sectors like gaming operators, governmental agencies, true continuous identity assurance from the enrollment process? Because they all have true identity assurance once their end user provides the document, the face, and then you have CRA data, and then you know who they are. But once they come back to start transacting, you know, to make payments, they don't have the same level of assurance. And that's where decentralization can help, and is helping, because it can bridge that gap from the very enrollment process to the transactional re-authentication process seamlessly and without any PII implications. That's, I think, the main thing to take into account.
It sounds fantastic, Frank. Thanks for walking us through that.
Yeah, and I think it's, yeah, I'm so glad we've had the chance to cover that just at the end there, because really when we talk about decentralized, it kind of, there's I think you can easily be misled to be like, well, where if the face isn't stored anywhere, that's what we've been going on about, the biometrics not stored anywhere, you can't go from and reuse your face. But actually the point is you can still be recognized across devices. So it bridges that gap between the convenience and the security, but while doing it in the privacy preserving manner, as Frank laid out.
And in such a way that even the most egregious failure of the bank, you know, a rogue Tobin, can't undermine the system.
It's the second time you've implied.
Well, I just want to use real examples, you know. I just want to use real examples.
David, you know about me that other people on this webinar don't, or even I know. Good, but yes, you're right. You're right. Those kind of nefarious internal and external actors.
The main user has been exactly that, Dave. You know, like for true identity assurance, for very risky, high risk transactions, multi-million payments. Because you know, you make that initial identification, you know, from the KYC process itself, you make it reusable across many different use cases. I think that's the main message to take from decentralization. The beauty of decentralization, you know, allowing true genuine identity assurance on the transactional side continuously and without data liabilities, PII implications, and the likes.
Yes. Okay. Great. I think that's probably a great place to wrap up now. We've got a second part where we're going to look more about the actual impact on financial sector and banks and payments specifically, and that really unifies the areas of David's expertise as well, so kind of the identity and then over to the payment. So really looking forward to that. If you missed any parts of this, if your connection was dropping out at any point, there's going to be an email afterwards with a recording, so you can catch up there. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for your time, and thank you, David and Frank, for talking us through this.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Tobin. Cheers, guys.
Bye bye.